Simon, first question is always, how have you cut through the fog?
There's a great quote I came across recently that says, we are all born unique, different, and an original. But so many of us die a copy of someone else.
Oh.
So for me, cutting through the fog is remembering who we are, remembering why we were born, and to build a life around those answers. To not get caught up with what everybody else thinks success is, but to remind ourselves who we are so we can live a life true to ourselves. When I look at society, I see so many people exhausted, not because they are physically doing too much, but because they are doing too little of the things that bring them joy, and they are living someone else's definition of success. So cutting through the fog for me is really living a life true to yourself, doing the work that makes you feel alive so you live, not just exist.
That's a wonderful answer. God, I wish I thought of that myself. But yeah, that really underpins what I believe cutting through the fog is too. And I think it's really even more so today than any other generation, maybe any other time in history, a certain time that I can think of. We need to have that sort of definition because people are looking for answers to questions they didn't even have questions before. And a lot of uncertainty, a lot of difficulty. And I think a lot of time people perceive it to be much more difficult than it really is. Now, I'm not saying there aren't problems. In fact, there are a lot of problems. But I think sometimes, maybe a lot of the time, in a business context, entrepreneurship provides an answer to some of those problems. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. And for me, this is what I found when I sort of went through different careers, that there is a big difference between success and fulfillment. Success is very much defined by what people can see. It's your status, it's your title, it's how much you earn. These are things that people on the outside will look at and judge you to be successful or not. Whereas fulfillment is very much internal. Fulfillment is, do you feel happy with what you're doing? Do you feel like you are living on purpose? Only you will know that. And that's why your challenge is to build your life around the answers of what fulfillment means to you. Entrepreneurship, as you said, John, it's a great way to have that impact because entrepreneurship is not really a job title. For me, it's a lifestyle. It's a way of being. It's where your mind is always focused on solving problems and creating solutions. That is thinking entrepreneurially. And I don't think you have to be an entrepreneur to access that mindset. You could still be in a community. You could still be working for a company, yet you still have the ability to think entrepreneurially.
And isn't it about confidence? People think, oh yeah, that sounds great, but that's theory. And I don't have the confidence to actually, deliver that. And then you hear this, what I call the yeah, butters, which is like, yeah, but it's easy for you because, you're you. Yeah. And yeah, but I could never do that. And yeah, like so many reasons, really, excuses for not actually trying, to be honest. Going back to like the reality of it, how do you give people, or how does somebody find the confidence to go, oh yeah, no, a belief system and value and purpose, we'll talk about in a minute, I can do that. That's a big leap for somebody who has never done it before.
When you venture into the unknown, you would never have done it before. The trap we fall into is we think we need confidence before we begin. Absolutely wrong. What you need before you take the first step is not confidence, but courage. The courage to go into the unknown. Confidence becomes a byproduct of doing the things you never thought you could do. So when you have the courage to take that first step and it works out better than you imagine, you start to build your bank of confidence. And then it gives you more courage to take on the next step and the next step and even to be bolder. And that improves your confidence. So confidence comes later, courage comes first. But what helps us practically to go from I can't, oh, but it's easier for you, is changing the story that you tell yourself. And stories are really powerful in the sense that the story you tell yourself about your past, your present, and your future determines the actions that you take. You might be very talented at something, but the moment you say to yourself, I can't, this isn't for me, I don't have what it takes, that talent becomes wasted. So it's how can you start changing the story you're telling yourself? Because ultimately, if you want to sell to others, it begins with selling to yourself. And if you can't sell you to you, it becomes near impossible to sell you to others.
I love your definition of courage versus confidence, because I speak a lot about having the courage of your convictions in terms of a business idea, entrepreneurship. And courage is it's kind of like this thing that slips between your fingers if you don't really know how to achieve it for you on your terms. And I want to bring resilience in here too, because I think that's really interesting. Well, what part does resilience play in this value system that you're describing?
Resilience is essential if you think about it, because whenever you embark on an unknown path, guaranteed you are going to face obstacles, setbacks, and challenges. It's part of any journey towards something that is meaningful to you. In fact, I always tell my clients and audiences that every goal will test you. The question is, how will you respond to those tests? Do you give up and go home? Or do you step back, reflect, and respond in a healthier and productive way? And so when we look at any path to success, you have to understand the role of mindset. The way that you interpret an event that you go through determines whether you thrive or you just go back into your comfort zone. And that resilience is built by understanding that the reality is that there is no good or bad, positive or negative. There is simply whatever you make of a situation. You get to choose the meaning that every experience has for you. Now, pain on its own, and you will experience some level of pain and struggle. Pain on its own is just suffering. You just go through suffering, you wallow in self-pity, and you can easily make yourself a victim of circumstance. But pain paired with reflection, that creates progress. Where you reflect on the painful periods and moments you've gone through, you take note, you understand yourself, and you access the wisdom to come back stronger.
Wow.
That's how resilience is built. If you don't spend time reflecting on what you've gone through, you never access the wisdom that is contained within every season of life that you go through.
Right. Then it's just a suffering through a bunch of shit circumstances, frankly.
Absolutely.
With no benefit.
I mean, there's a great analogy that I was discussing with a friend recently. And what we were saying is that if you look at every superhero film, you have a superhero and you have a villain. Now, what is common between a superhero and a villain is that they've both experienced pain and struggle in their life. But how they chose to respond to it meant they ended up becoming a superhero or they ended up becoming a villain. If something traumatic happened to you and you chose the response of, because this happened to me, I'm going to wreak chaos on the rest of the world, you become a villain. Or if you choose the response, because this happened to me, I don't want this to happen to anyone else, you become a superhero.
Wonderful analogy. I think we can all relate to that. I definitely want to get into some of your personal story in terms of what that means to you in a moment. But I've just had a thought as well, because and it's not a question of pointing blame or trying to find somebody who's responsible for this. But the lack of resilience that I see amongst the younger generation. I know the older generation always tends to dump on the younger generation. That's a theme that happens. But I hope I'm much more constructive than that. And I actually see a lot of the time that this lack of resilience, as I call it, it's an easy label to throw around, is a function of the environment. So you've got the individual, as you're describing, and take responsibility for yourself and do things the way you just described, which is fantastic. But we all live in an environment, and the environment hasn't been conducive to what I'm just describing here. And I think it's this generation, us lot, me, in terms of that generation that have brought the Gen Zs into this environment. And there's a great term in Germany, they call it the Rasenmäher or lawnmower. But the lawnmower mentality, which is the parents are like lawnmowers, which means they go around mowing the lawn and the kids follow along behind them. So all the kids as they're growing up ever see is this wonderfully manicured lawn. They never have to tromp through the weeds. And then they went into the world and they found the world is full of weeds. And they're surprised and they got lack of resilience and they feel like, reacting to a situation which they're not prepared for. Tell me about that. Do you see that? And if so, what does it mean to you? And have you had any experience of this in your own world?
Yeah, I can see some truth to what you said there, John. But as I was listening to you, it reminded me of my role as a parent.
Right.
So my wife and I, we have a 5-year-old daughter. And we're very mindful of exactly what you said there. We don't want her to rely on us all the time. Because when you're always seeking approval from other people or validation from someone else, how can you be resilient? How can you decide and make your own choices?
Right.
One of the things we're very mindful of right now is whenever she goes through something that is painful, whenever she is nervous or anxious about something, rather than jump immediately to the question, Mum, Dad, what would you do? Mum, Dad, what would you say I should be doing? What advice do you have for me? What we want to do is also switch it around the other way, where I, as her father, also ask her for advice. So I might say to her, hey, Sienna, Dad's got a big speaking event next week. It's the biggest audience he's ever spoken to. And he's feeling a little nervous. What advice do you have for me?
Really?
And just to allow her to share her answers, her advice, her thoughts, and they're very pure, by the way, for a 5-year-old.
Sure.
But what happens is by getting her advice, not only does it show her opinion is valued by her parents, but also it's showing her subconsciously she has the answers. So when she goes through a period as well where she might be nervous, when she might be anxious, she can then look inside and go, actually, I gave the same advice to Dad. I know the answers. So that's one of the ways we're trying to teach her resilience, is trying to turn it back to her as if she is giving us counsel, rather than tell her every time you face an obstacle, come running to Mum or Dad.
Yeah, that's very smart. I mean, we all learn lessons all the way through life, but the lessons that are really a great benefit to us are the ones we learn from our kids. Because we're so easily influenced. And we take it on board. And something, if you learn something through a tragedy or something that happened, like for example, I was a kid, obviously at 6 years of age, and my dad had a farm in Ireland, and one particular year all the calves died. And it was a very traumatic situation. And I was kind of thinking, well, I mean, that's the end. All the calves are dead. Then, we're going to die and over. And it was so traumatic in a place which was so familiar to me, and a place of, which was free from threat, and it was where I grew up. So I owned it and I knew it and I felt safe there. Suddenly it was up on its head. And my dad said, no, we're not going to die. We're just going to buy some more calves, of course. But then I realized, well, all this bad stuff can happen to you, and it's not your fault. You just got to somehow brush it off and look to the next step. You can't undo stuff that's gone wrong. Something went wrong outside of our control, certainly from my point of view, and we survived it. Hey, how cool is that? I can survive anything. And that was a lesson I learned when I was 6.
That's so empowering.
Isn't it?
When I was young, I grew up in a very strict Asian household. My brother and I, we were very afraid of getting things wrong. Because when things went wrong, if you dropped something, if you made a mess, even if it wasn't by intention, you did something to upset your parents, then we were shouted at, we were disciplined.
There were consequences.
But now, going through my entrepreneurial journey and understanding psychology a lot better, when I work with my daughter, if we both understand that it was not intentional, that what happened was an accident, then the response I choose is one of calmness. It's okay, it happened. What are we going to do about it? If she drops a glass on the floor by accident, then we clean it up together. And so it's reassuring her that, these things are going to happen in life. You are going to make mistakes. You are going to drop things. You are going to do things unintentionally. But why turn it into something bigger than it actually is?
That's a great lesson, not just for life, but for business, and certainly for entrepreneurial business, because things happen to you all the time.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of the problems is we feel like, first of all, we should be perfect, and these things shouldn't be happening to us, and it's our fault when they happen, and then we take them personally, because, I should have avoided, I should have done something. Well, no, you shouldn't actually. You should have just done what you're doing, and let this happen, and feel the pain if necessary, but just think about how you're going to do next.
Whenever my daughter tries something, so whether she's learning a musical instrument, or she is singing, or she's performing, the way I teach her to avoid dwelling on what happened, because we can be our own harshest critic.
Absolutely.
Instead of saying, well, what went well, what didn't go well, why didn't I do as well as I wanted to do, I say to her, focus on the things that you can control. So ask yourself, what could go better next time? And then your mind is focused on improvement, not dwelling on something that is now outside of your control.
In terms of getting back to your story, I love to tease out some of the elements of your story that have made you the person you are today. You say people should wake up to the life that they're living and focus on that, as opposed to dream about the life that they could probably potentially never aspire to, but certainly not the life they're living, somebody else's life. Tell me more about that, and when that happened for you. When did you wake up to the life you were living?
It's funny because it really happened by accident. So I grew up with this mistaken belief that success in life is determined by your job title, your status, and how much you were earning. And so after being seduced during my teenage years by films like Trading Places, Boiler Room, and Wall Street, I got into financial services. But it was the worst possible timing. It was the middle of 2007, a year before the global financial crisis swept across the planet. And just to make things a little interesting, the company I started with was Lehman Brothers, which collapsed into bankruptcy 14 months after I joined. And in hindsight, it was the financial crisis that kickstarted for me what I believe is the longest journey we make as humans, which are the inches from our heads to our hearts. Never an easy journey, but the most important and fulfilling we will ever embark on. So that's really when the process for me of waking up began. And I was asking myself, well, this clearly isn't working out in the financial services industry. So what does success really mean to me? What does fulfillment look like? And I started brainstorming ideas on a blank sheet of paper, putting myself in the position of the 80-year-old version of me, as if I hadn't done
80-year-old version.
The 80-year-old version of
Okay.
me, if I hadn't done anything that I wanted to do in life. Which of the things would I regret the most? And I just started brainstorming all the things that came to my mind. And I circled the ones that I would regret the most. And I just started following my curiosities. One of those things was working for myself, starting a business, doing something outside of finance. It was an unknown path. I hadn't had any background in business. Nobody in my immediate family had started their own business. And so the first step to really changing where I was and where I wanted to be began with my environment. I knew I had to change what I was immersing my mind into, whether it was the books I read, what I watched, what I listened to, the events I attended, the people I spoke with. That was the very first step that changed where I was and altered the trajectory to what I'm now doing today.
But you got to be really honest with yourself to do all that. And I love the idea of going to the end and looking back in advance.
Yeah.
It's like, I use that in a business analogy context. I talk about the pre-mortem. Everybody talks about a post-mortem when you have a problem. Like a business goes post-mortem, went wrong, what can we do to prevent us doing that again? Great thing to do. However, pre-mortem is it's going to go bust. Think about things that make it go in that direction. In other words, what about this business concept could go wrong? Itemize, there's going to be 20. Itemize the top 3 and figure out what you can do to mitigate those risks. So in other words, try to preempt how they're going to go wrong and then purposefully make sure they go right.
Absolutely.
It's a really beneficial, proactive, pre-mortem, I call it. But I think that's what you did with your own life, right?
Yeah, and then I just started testing in the same way as scientists would when they're conducting experiments, is that they're not attached to whether it works out or not. They just conduct lots of experiments, they observe, they reflect, and then they carry their findings into the next experiment. They call these trials. They carry lots of trials, and when they get to a breakthrough, then that's a result of doing lots of experiments and trials. But when we look at life, we tend to have a negative association to failure. But if we approached it with the same mindset that a scientist would, and just see these things as experiments, it becomes a lot more fun. So for me, it was, okay, on the side of my day job in the evenings and weekends I had, what sort of experiments could I conduct to see if the thing I'm interested in could be the thing that I do long term? And so it was experimenting with building relationships. It was experimenting with reading books, learning new subjects and topics that would help me in my next career in the world of business and entrepreneurship. And it just gamified the entire process. I often say that when the process feels fun, you're more likely to follow through with it than if it feels like a chore. If it feels like a chore and it drains your energy, you're not going to do it on the days where you don't feel great.
But there's a significant level of self-awareness required for that to work. It's a very subjective process you describe. Objective process you described there. Whereas most people are very subjective about themselves because they're living in their life and they're dealing with all the pressures, all the emotions, all the stuff that gets in the way of being that objective. How do you make that work in real life?
You're right. That's why awareness is literally the first step. If you're not aware of what you must change for new life to happen, you're never going to take action. Awareness can come from a question somebody asks you at the right time that really gets you introspective. Or it can come from being around people far ahead of you, where you might like to be, that completely blows open your ceiling of possibility and gets you thinking, wow, this is possible? Maybe I can do this as well?
That's been quite smart. I got to say, that's been, I would say, a lot smarter than most people are or want, ever allow themselves to be. That's quite a smart thing to do.
Yeah, and this is why when, a question I've got asked before is with my coaching and mentoring, for example, people have often asked me, Simon, can anybody be coached or mentored? And I've said, no. Not everybody. They have to be ready and they have to want to be coached and mentored because you can't change anybody unless they themselves want to change first.
Sure.
If they have decided that they want to change and to make a better story out of their life, that's the first step in making real transformation.
Sure. From an investment context, I'm involved in lots of different investment platforms. We have a VC, for example, a VC fund where we make investment decisions. And a lot of the time it is all the criteria you look at in investment, obviously, but it's the person as well, the entrepreneur. And how listenable are they, if that's even a word? Now, I'm not saying I've got all the answers. I'm not going to tell them anything, but how listenable are they? The whole idea is you're a bright young chap or bright young girl who's got an idea. Fantastic. I want to get behind this because they'll uproot trees and they'll make it happen. So there's sort of idea and person you want to get behind, but how listenable are they as well? Because they're going to make mistakes, and we can preempt maybe some of those by having somebody with a few grey hairs behind them, literally, and advising them on that. But how listenable are they? And people need to be open to listen. And I often say, oh, wouldn't it be so cool if I could go back to 25 and take me with me and be able to implement all that knowledge I've got and experience I've got. But I would have had to take the advice and listen to the advice. I'm not sure I would have done that, really. Because, there's a certain amount of arrogance about being an entrepreneur. You just go, no, I'm going to do it anyway. How do you get the right balance? How do you strike the right balance at the different stage of your life, going through 25 to 55, whatever it might be, and everything in between?
Yeah, and sometimes this is where experience comes into play. Because as you said, when you're younger, when you're 20-something, you feel like you're unstoppable. Yep. You feel like you have all the answers, and you can be a little arrogant. But once you get into business, once you make lots of mistakes and failures, and you see other people achieving what you want to achieve, but in a very different way, you realize, oh, maybe there is a different way to get there.
Sure.
Maybe I don't know everything. And so there's a process where we go from ego to humility. And it's why humility, if people have it, it's so refreshing. And I remember watching Gareth Southgate do an interview recently. And he got a question from the interviewer saying, Gareth, you've now stepped back from being England manager. The England team are preparing for the World Cup under their new manager, Thomas Tuchel. You could have any job you want, working in the media, commentating about England, talking about the new setup. Why aren't we seeing you? You're not in the media. You're not commentating. And his response to me was pure humility, but also class. He said, everything I've done has been selfless. It's all about the team because we never get to the top alone. And what he said is that if I go to the media and do the rounds and I talk about and analyze the England games and I talk about my views of the manager, guess what's going to happen? I'm going to be casting a shadow over the England team. People in the press will say, hey, this is what Gareth thought about the win. This is what Gareth thought about the loss. This is what Gareth thinks about the England manager. I don't want that. It's better if I stay away from that, because then the England team can focus on their preparations for the World Cup. That, for me, was an example of humility. And you need to have humility to listen, that there could be another way, that you might not be doing it in the best way. And so going back to what you were saying about people being coachable or listenable, when you have someone like that, it makes a relationship so much healthier, so much more productive than someone who, as much as you throw their way, just ignores everything. And they then make mistakes which you knew were going to come, but you could have avoided some.
You could have predicted it at times. It's so refreshing to find that humility where sometimes you don't expect it. Gareth Southgate is a great example of that. He's the most untypical football manager. You know what I mean? You think about it. I sometimes think about it as well from an entrepreneurial point of view, and that there is some point in your business life. Let's say they call it 2 years in. Where you've started up the business and you're 2 years in now. And you can quite legitimately look back over those 2 years and say, I've got this business to where it is right now because of me. People told me I was wrong. I look at me now. And justifiably, absolutely, I've made the decisions. I've made the difference. If I wasn't here, it wouldn't have been a business. I wouldn't have got this far, which is great. The mistake that entrepreneurs, strong-headed, if you like, successful entrepreneurs make, or even arrogant, egotistical entrepreneurs, and a certain element, I think, in getting there, is that they're going to say, for the next 2 years, it's going to be the same. Whereas at that point, wherever that point is, you got to be more humble and say, I've got it to here, yes, but I'm not going to get it to there. And I'm going to end up being the obstacle to progress, and I'm never going to realize the ambition that I've got for this business. But I got to bring people in who are better at this, and this than I am, and I'm going to stop doing things and meddling, looking over their shoulder, and directing them and motivating them. And that's my role from now on. But that takes a lot of humility, which a lot of people don't have at the right time.
If we take a small startup, let's say it's you and a few friends around a table, you don't really have to understand much about people management because you're just all hustling, you're getting things done, you're moving very fast, breaking things and learning along the way. But as a startup grows, and then you have teams, and then teams managed by someone, or you're growing internationally, now a lot of your role now becomes about people management. How do you create other leaders within your organization that you're building, so that they don't always need you in there, so they can keep the business going. And that does require humility, because it's moving away from saying, well, this is a result of me, to this is a result of us. And this is why when people talk about my journey, I always say it is never a one-person team. I'm where I am because of so many people. In fact, when I talk about my book, I always say the favorite part of my book isn't a chapter. It is the acknowledgement section. Because when I put that together, it really made me reflect on every single person that has got me to where I am, whether it's my partner, whether it's my close friends.
In your entire life, not just the book.
Absolutely.
Right.
Whether it's the first client that trusted me enough to say yes.
Right.
Whether it's the person that referred me to business, or that said, you should come to my company and deliver a talk to the leadership team. Without these people giving me an opportunity, supporting me, encouraging me, or believing in me, I could never be where I am today. And I think we are the product of our own environment. And it's why I don't really believe this idea of self-made. I don't think we're self-made. We are community-made. And we can't forget that in any journey to success.
Get back to the post-2008, which is a very traumatic time for you in terms of like a bit of a shock, I suppose, really, for you. But here's an accusation is like, before I go to the accusation, you got to have courage to say no and to make a change, is where I'm going with this. And the accusation is, well, no, stick with it. You chose this path, so make it bloody well work now, is the old-fashioned approach. And there's a certain element of that, but at some point you got to go, this is making me this is draining all my energy, making me so unhappy. And there's a realization which is much bigger here, which I'm going to go for. And I go, quitter. You get, trying to get back on, you never be anything. Accusation. Tell me about that, because you got to deal with that too. People probably said that to you in your life, and you probably said it to yourself. I'm not going to give up now, put so much energy into it.
I very much did have those thoughts in my head, especially because I knew that my father, a Chinese man, would not be happy if I were to tell him, well, thank you for investing in my education at university.
Okay.
Thank you for raising me through formal education and getting me to a good job in finance. I'm now going to quit and go down a route where nothing is certain. That I had playing in my head again and again and again. Because I had I had some idea, but I had no idea how he would react. And so he had a slightly lagged experience of my journey. Because even when I quit, I didn't tell him yet I'd quit for a couple of years, knowing that the response may not have been that nice.
Not supportive. Anyway.
Not supportive. Yeah. And so it's tough, because you're naturally going to have those thoughts. But I keep coming back to the fact that we only have one life. And losing my mum at 17 really brought that home. We think we have forever, but we don't. And I see that the greatest tragedy is so many of us live as if we are never going to die, and then die having never really lived. I didn't want to waste that one life. And I also thought that the greatest tragedy, in addition to that, is getting to the top of a mountain that was never yours to climb. Because then you never appreciate it. You get that you might have the accolades, you might have the title, you might have the accomplishments. But if it's not you, and it's not aligned to who you are and your values, it's empty. It's a very empty feeling. Realizing that and understanding that gave me the option of either staying where I was and maybe treating what I wanted to as a very small side hustle, or making the side hustle my main hustle and quitting my day job. And it wasn't easy. It's never easy. I think on the outside it can look easy when people describe the journey and say, you quit, you launched this, and you've built this incredible business.
But again.
What people forget is that there is also the mental side that comes with that is entirely invisible. Because nobody knows what is going through someone's mind at any given point, especially when you have to make such big life decisions like those.
It's the uncertainty. People don't know at the time how the story is going to end. You've come out the other end happy, more successful, happy, and a lot of stuff figured out. And you impart that knowledge and experience to others, and you help people get on a similar sort of path for them. But the point about it is, at the time you're thinking, oh my God, I'm going to give up all this, and I'm going to do what exactly? And it's not really very well defined, and you don't know how it's going to end up. And that's really the courage, really, to say, no, I'm going to keep on this path. Because usually in podcasts or on social media, or if you're interviewing somebody, you get to interview somebody because they've succeeded at something, not because they've failed at something. At the point when you were sitting at your worst, like when my middle business went bust in the States, I was sitting there going, oh my God, there was so much at stake, so much high expectation, and it didn't work.
Yeah.
So I'm then going, like, so what happens next? And that's the key point. What do I do next? What do I do about it? But it's so easy to go into this vortex of self-pity, and the world will have to get me, and nobody cares. Nobody really cares about that. You could just sit there and carry out your own little post-mortem over and over and over again, and it doesn't help. But you got to get out of that situation and do something next. And for me, it was I was one thing I was sure about. I was not going to go out in a failure, especially as I started on a success. I had no idea what the next bit was going to be, but I was going to figure it out. This wasn't my postscript. This wasn't going to be I ended in a failure, and nobody wants to talk about failure. Although I always talk about failure because you learn so much from it. But you were in a situation in 2008, and it was a big shock. So you took really an advantage of a defining moment where the crash happened to put that to work and for your benefit. So I think sometimes people need that push, don't they, from something external happens, which is a shock.
Yeah,
to
we shouldn't, and I don't think it's always necessary, because there are some stories where people haven't had that push. But in many cases, the stories we read about, the stories we follow, it has often been a painful moment of trauma that has triggered a change in someone's life. For me, that was one of the events. And in many other stories I've read, it has been a similar event in their own lives that has triggered a big shift in their direction. But also, I think what helped, and I think it is important for anybody embarking on a path that is unknown, is the ability to find peace with the fact that there are going to be a lot of things outside of your control. And that we have no idea where you will be a year, 3 or 5 years from now. A lot of businesses, when they start, they put together 5-year plans and 7-year plans for the business. But a lot of these numbers are just plucked out of thin air. Nobody really knows. 6 months from now, it might be completely different. And so the statement I told myself at the time, which helped me, is that if the path ahead of you is clear, it is not your path. Whereas if the path ahead of you is unknown, and very often you have no clue where it's going to lead to, that's beautiful, because it means it's your path. It means you are figuring out your place in the world. Now, if you told me when I quit finance that I could build a thriving one-to-one coaching practice, I would have probably taken it. But at the same time, I would have closed myself off to all of these different turning points I've been on since. Started off coaching, then went into speaking, then went into writing books, creating content, advising businesses. I mean, all of these different turns would not have happened unless I just went with where things flowed, was open to wherever my path may lead to, and just being open to conversations, relationships, and seeing where my strengths lay, because it's a beautiful journey of self-development and self-realization.
So it's the journey more than the destination. Well, it is the journey, right? It's full of little mini destinations along the way.
That is the greatest reward. Too many of us think the greatest reward in any journey is what we get, whether it's the money you make, whether it's the destination. But the reality is, as you embark on the journey, you realize there is no end. There truly is no end. It's a process of becoming. Every single day, if you are just a little better than who you were yesterday, you are evolving, adapting, and becoming someone who can tackle whatever challenges the world throws your way.
Uncertainty is all around us. You never get to a point, let's things settle down when they're less uncertain, and then I'll do it. Well, you never will, because it'll be something else that'll be uncertain, and there'll always be uncertainty.
And again, this is a trap people fall into. They think that ready is a feeling. What they forget is actually ready is a decision. You decide to be ready, and then you begin. When you decided you're ready for a journey, things start falling into place. You give your subconscious something to focus on. You
generate the impetus, and things begin to happen. As
you create momentum.
You create momentum.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I've been talking to some Gen Zs about this, and building in public. I go, what exactly does that mean? Being a little bit cautious about. That's a great idea. I mean, in theory, sure, but actually, what it really is talking about the business you're building.
Yeah.
You're not building in public, you're really talking about it.
Yeah, you're communicating.
But you're being very honest about it and very genuine and authentic about it. And you're coming back to explain where you are at this particular juncture. Nothing's done yet. In fact, it still does a whole bunch of ideas and then begin to define it. So you are building your business in public. And that's on social media, I mean. Yes, people can see it. And people love that. People relate to that. What do you think about that?
I would summarize that as one of the activities from increasing your luck surface area. So I always say to people, every day you begin, you're always given two options. You have the option of just sitting on your couch and watching Netflix, or you have the option of increasing your luck surface area. Now, if you're just sitting at home watching Netflix, your luck's probably zero. You're not creating much lucky opportunities. But if you document your journey, if you go out and meet people, if you go out and share your work, if you be part of communities and events, you are increasing your luck surface area. You are increasing the probability, again, not guaranteed, but you're increasing the probability of opportunities coming into your orbit. But you can only do that if you're showing up in some small way. So whenever I have options of how to spend my day, I always choose the option that has the probability of increasing luck in my orbit. So going to an event and sitting at the front, that immediately increases the chance of luck, the people you meet. You might even get to have a conversation with the speaker. Showing up at community events, you never know. One conversation could change your direction. One new relationship could open up a door to an opportunity you would have otherwise be blind to. Always choose the option that stacks the odds in your favor that something good will work out.
And I always quote Arnold Palmer, 1964 Masters, when he won it for the fifth time, whatever. Well, somebody, the post 18th hole interview was, oh, you had a look at the green today, didn't you? And he goes, yeah, you know what? It's strange that the more I practice, the luckier I become. And I thought that's a great put down, because it's not luck, nothing to do with it. Or it does, but you make luck work to your benefit. You increase your chances of luck. You did a whole bunch of different things to make sure luck came your way, if you even want to call it luck.
Absolutely. The way I see it is that the more lucky moments you create, it's like you are planting seeds in a lot of places, but you have no idea which one of those seeds will eventually blossom to become an orchard. All you can control is how many seeds you plant.
Right.
And the more seeds you plant, the greater the chance that a few of them might just blossom into opportunities.
That is contrary to the way I was, not the upbringing I had, but the manifest, if you like, of culture, expectation in those days was suited and booted and everything under control. And everything comes from me, as opposed to, let me tell you how it is. Or let me show you how it is. Or I'm got a clue inside, but I'm going to give the pretense that I know what I'm talking about here, because everybody always did that. If you think about in the 60s and 70s, people were suited and booted, literally suited and booted, and there was an aura, and it was very male dominated. It was an aura of, I can never break into that. It's not accessible. Whereas these days it's much more, well, I have an idea. I'm smart about this, but I'm not going to do it on my own, to your point. And it's a bit of a half-baked idea, but I'm going to put it out there. And then what happens is somebody comes, you know what, that's a great idea. I've thought about that too. And then guess what? You have a team of people who think like-minded, and you can bounce ideas, and you come away thinking, oh, I'm a lot further than I was before I had that conversation. That's the opposite of having all the answers yourself. That's allowing discourse, allowing input, allowing creativity, allowing innovation, whatever you want to call it in a business context, to happen in a way that benefits you, because then somebody will do the same, and you can feed back to them, right?
And there's a word you said there, John, which I think is important: creativity. Entrepreneurship is a lot to do about creativity, because you are going to get rejected a lot. You're going to be told no a lot, and you can either accept those no's and rejections, or you can find a creative way to still make progress despite that. And creativity is about creating your own doors. You know, if I look at people's journeys in life, you really have two doors. The first is where you have to work hard. You hope somebody picks your product or service or idea up. You get a nice break, and you get to the next level of your journey. But it's not always guaranteed. You have to be creative enough to create your own doors. In the same way I said earlier how I would sit at the front of the events I attended. That's how I got to know speakers. That's how I got to know the organizers of the events. That's how I met some really interesting people.
Sure. It's easier to ask a question as well.
And then the way you create those third doors is then finding ways to add value to people you want to learn from. In fact, I remember I got asked one time about if I could only spend 1 hour a week focused on my business, how would I spend that 1 hour? And I said, well, if I only had 1 hour a week to focus on my business, I would take people for coffees and lunches, because more has come from the relationships I've built than anything else in my business journey.
Really?
And so it's about getting access to people's insights, their wisdom, their networks. That for me is such an important step, because business is about people. If you connect with people, if you're someone who adds value into people's lives, people want you in their orbit. They want you in their circle.
Let's get back to your story, if you like. And not only did you make this courageous move, okay, there was a worldwide calamity going on in terms of the meltdown, but you were involved right at the front line. You were in Lehman's, not only in the financial services industry, but you were in Lehman's, which disappeared overnight, and nobody ever thought that could ever be the case. So a lot of things, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of upheaval, a lot of things happening. Like gravity was redefined. Not only that, though, you made the choice to move from what was very much a corporate life, established, into an entrepreneurial life. So that's a big cultural shift. I mean, you didn't have a choice and it just happened, or you purposely decided to go that way? How did that work out?
I faced a choice. And looking at many entrepreneurs, many were surprisingly, in the books I read, many of the entrepreneurs we look up to were surprisingly also quite reluctant entrepreneurs, in the sense that they were very risk averse until they faced a dilemma. And I reached the same point myself. So I was building this side hustle to the point I had 3 coaching clients on the side of my day job. The dilemma was, do I continue with my day job and limit my side hustle to just 3 clients? Because I couldn't take on anymore. I could only do this on evenings and weekends if I didn't want to destroy the quality of my day job. Sure. I said, if I got a 4th client, I cannot coach them well, and my day job would suffer. I wouldn't be able to deliver value in my day job. And so the choice became, stick with it, limit to 3, or quit and see how far this can go. And that was a process of a few months going back and forth in my head. But after speaking to lots of people, after being in some very productive environments, I decided to hand in my notice. And I said, let's just see how far this goes.
And everybody called you crazy.
Everybody called me crazy. Everybody who was at work, actually, first of all, they said to me, well done, you're not going to a competitor. That was the first response, followed by, what are you doing? They thought I was crazy. I mean, it just reminded me of Steve Jobs' quote when he said, here's to the crazy ones. You have to be a little crazy, I think, to make that jump, because as we've touched on, you have no clue how it's going to work out. Nothing is, at least for the first few years, nothing is certain. And you're having to learn everything on the spot. When you're in a company, you've got other colleagues who can kind of take off some of the work from you and who can focus on certain areas. But when the business is you, all of it rests on you. You're learning everything from scratch. And I think it's the sort of experience that an MBA cannot teach you. An MBA teaches you theory, but when you go through starting a business for yourself, that's where the real lessons are learned.
It's like jumping out
of a lot of courage.
Jumping out of a plane without a parachute and trying to figure out the way down. People use that analogy, which is a bit crazy. I mean, it's not quite that risky, I suppose, is the word. Or you're not throwing caution completely to the wind. You have some degree of, this is going to be a huge change, but I can control it and manage it, or I can.
And this is where belief is so important. You've got to believe and trust in yourself that you can manage whatever happens. But it's also not for the faint-hearted. I always say, be careful what you wish for. When you're going from employment to entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship is going to stretch you out of your comfort zone every single day. If you're okay with that, if you can accept that is the price of entry into entrepreneurship, you'll be okay.
I think I remember you saying as well about playing small and decide to play big. So how do you play big?
Yeah, so first of all, the situation I'm referring to when I said that is that the problem isn't that we aim too high and we miss. The problem is that we aim too low and we succeed. And so by playing small, it's by making your goals not big enough or challenging enough that stretches you into a completely new version of who you can be. So for me, playing big isn't limiting my thoughts on what I can achieve. Because what happens is somebody says to you, well, if you had a blank canvas, what do you want to accomplish in life? Who do you want to be in life? Before we answer, immediately the inner critic jumps in and says, well, is that actually possible? Do I really want that? Can you actually get there? And so we end up filtering down what we actually want, and then we put it down onto paper. So what I say to people is that if it comes up in your head, put it down before you overthink. before the inner critic jumps in, because there's a reason you've thought about that. So as soon as it comes into your head, jot it down onto paper. However big it is, put it down before you start overanalyzing. And then once you've got it all down on paper, ask yourself, what must happen for this to become a reality? Because the bigger you think, the more different the game that you play. And that puts you in a very different category. If you're aiming for playing small, that category is very competitive. There's a lot of people in that middle. But on the other side, there's not as many people there.
Sure.
There's not as many people aiming for something big and extraordinary in life. Because when you think at that level, you show up differently.
Yeah.
The way you approach the journey is very different. If I wanted a certain caliber person to endorse my book, for example, I have to play a very different game to someone who just wants a friend they've known for 10 years to endorse their book.
Sure.
It's a very different game.
But we're going to have to move on to Mr. Energy, because this defines you. The energy in the room, the energy you bring, or you talk a lot about this. I guess you work with your clients on energy.
Yeah.
But maybe define it a little bit better than I have. I just threw that out there. Energy,
Sure.
What does it mean to you? How do you make it work for you? What's the essence of positive energy in a business environment? Let's put it that way.
So first of all, just to give some context, we all know about energy as a life force. So if you look into popular culture, Star Wars calls it the Force. In yoga, if you practice yoga, they call it prana. In my culture, they call it chi. So we all have different terms for it. But when it comes to business and entrepreneurship and our own daily lives, we don't really address it. We don't really work on our own energy. And energy in business is really important because people do not buy, I believe people do not buy your ideas, your products or services as much as they buy your energy. And energy is simply a transference of emotion. This is why one of my favorite quotes by Maya Angelou goes, people will forget what you did, people will forget what you said, but they will never forget the way you made them feel. And that's why energy is so important. And if you are growing a company, the energy that you bring into that organization is the greatest relationship you're going to have to activate the energy of your workforce. So I remember when I was in employment, when the boss came into the office, before saying a single word, you could tell whether they've had a bad or good night. And that energy would affect the entire floor in the office. That's how powerful energy can be. So when we think about improving our own energy, it's to work on our physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual energy. That's the way I see it through. Physical energy is obvious. It's the thing we can see the most. It's your sleep, it's nutrition, it's movement. Mental energy is all about focus and creativity and your mindset. Emotional energy is relationships with yourself, with your colleagues, with your loved ones. And spiritual energy is all about meaning and purpose. If you're doing something that makes you feel alive, that gives you purpose, you awaken one of the greatest sources of energy that there is going. If you see purpose in what you do, you go above and beyond the basic job description.
I think sometimes people are aware of energy, but only to a point where it dictates them, or it's like a reaction. I'm in a good mood today, so things are going to go well. Oh, that's great, cool. I'm having a good day. So it's something that happens to them, as opposed to purposefully
being intentional.
Exactly, being intentional. How do you be intentional then? How do you make sure that you turn up and play the game you want to play in the way you want to play it, and bring everybody with you, even on the bad days?
The first thing to understand is consistency always beats intensity. So what I mean by that is, if we take health, for example, somebody might think, unless I can block out an hour each day to address my health, whether it's going for a walk, going to the gym, going for a swim, I'm not going to do it. But the reality is, you're rarely going to get an hour every single day. Some days it might be 30 minutes. Another day you might have 2 hours if it's not a busy day. It's just adapting your day so that the habit is consistent, even if it's not of the same intensity.
So it's all about behaviors.
It's behaviors.
Yeah, right.
And the behaviors start from identity. So what I mean by that is, instead of thinking about what do you want to do or accomplish, ask yourself instead, who do I want to be? What's the sort of person I want to become? And out of that, you might say something like, well, I want to become someone who lives a long life, someone who leads a healthy lifestyle, someone who has the energy to run an organization and make it successful. Now, once you have a bit of clarity as to the identity of the person you want to become, then the choices become a lot easier. If you go into a supermarket for your weekly shop and you are operating from the identity of, I am an athlete, then it's very unlikely you're going to push your trolley through the junk food aisle. You're going to be putting into your trolley healthy food options. And so identity is where it begins. And then it's just understanding when you work best. Are you a morning person? Are you an evening person? Do you need to take a day off each week in order to reset and rejuvenate? That's a process of self-awareness. And so it's creating boundaries, it's understanding how you operate best, and realizing that it's not just about a long life, it's about a healthy life as well. And that the choices you make today determine where you will be tomorrow. Better put, actually, there's a quote that goes, when you are born, you look like your parents. When you're older, you look like your choices. And so the choices you make show in your face, they show in your results, and they show in the interaction you have with other people.
I really like that. It's not just profound, sitting in the clouds. It's actually applicable. You can make it work. And the whole question was that how do you make this work in reality? And one thing you said in there was like, you recognize how it works for you.
Yeah.
And which means to me that you put yourself first. I think most of the time in Western society, we're all conforming to what's expected of us as opposed to thinking what we want to do. Now, there's a certain amount of arrogance there, but you have to be a little bit arrogant, I suppose, to put yourself first in the wake of you've been told constantly you got to conform to expectation. Where do you break into that? Or is that something you have to be like since you've been 6 as a kid? Or is there a self-realization, I've been doing this all wrong. I've been trying to conform to an expectancy as opposed to doing what is right for me.
So I've always been, and again, this could have been cultural or societal, I've always been a people pleaser. So, I've always been someone that said yes to things. I felt out of kindness, out of wanting to help my family and friends. If they wanted me to contribute to something, I would always say yes. But I realized that if I wanted to make a real impact, and I always said yes to people, I could never really help people from a position of being burnt out, from being in a position where I had no energy to do things well. And so if I focus on myself, not in a selfish way, because actually it's a selfless way, when you focus on yourself, look after your health, look after your mental health as well, and ensure that you can show up each day with a certain level of energy, you actually give better service to everyone around you. Mm-hmm. You're able to be more present. You're able to listen deeply to the people you have conversations with when you have the energy.
That's what I call the air steward announcement. Put your own mask on before you put on mask of any elderly people or kids that are traveling with you. It makes a lot of sense. People tend to not do that, though, of course, because they're overpleased or try to help each other out and they forget about themselves. How do you make sure you do put yourself first so you can be of service to others or your business or whatever it is?
Really easy, applicable point anybody can do right now is if you open your calendar, start blocking out me time in your calendar. Because what happens in reality is that we're quick to say yes to business meetings. We're quick to say yes to social meetings or holidays. And so they go straight into our calendar. But we're not so quick at blocking out me time. And the reason this is important is if you do not block out me time in your calendar, and people don't have to know what you're doing in your me time, but it's just blocked out so they know not to put a meeting in there, other people will always claim that time away from you unless you've already claimed it already. I don't know why I said yes to all of these things. Yeah. And now you're just running from meeting to meeting to meeting, and you're just busy but not going anywhere.
Right.
You're in motion but not productive. And so it's thinking ahead of time and understanding that you need that white space, that stillness to reset your energy so you can move through the weeks and months ahead in a very calm and peaceful and intentional way, not one where you're constantly exhausted and drained.
So it's about having focus, it's about having the right priorities which fit your values, but it's also within all of that, making sure that you're investing in yourself, whether it's time for regeneration or time for yourself.
It's finding that rhythm between deep work, where you actually get stuff done, and where you rest, where you pull back and you rest and reflect.
What about I'm going to interrupt here. What about I'll rest when I'm dead kind of attitude, which is so typical, Gen X.
And this is a really...
How does that?
A really bad idea to have, I think, because we treat rest as a reward. Well, once I've done this, then I'll rest. Well, once the year is over, then I'll rest. Once I've sold the business, then I will rest. But actually, what happens is that the best operators are those who find that rhythm between work and rest, knowing that work and rest are partners of the same team. Because there's no point getting to wherever you want to get to, and you can't enjoy it because you sacrificed your health. And then you're in a hospital bed, burnt out, full of regret of what you could have done differently. So for me, it's to treat work and rest as partners of the same team. Now, if you work to the exclusion of rest, you will burn out. If you rest to the exclusion of work, well, nothing gets done. But the situation many people are in is that when we think about deep work, getting things done, and pulling back and resting, we're doing neither. We're in this so-called anxious middle. We're never fully working because we're distracted and we're thinking about rest. Right. And we're never fully resting because we're thinking about the work we have to do. And so it's about being intentional with rest as well as the work side.
So what do you think of, the kind of the entrepreneur phrase, which is always on, always available, always, just call me and I'll respond, or whatever, this sort of, I'm a servant of my business because I want my business to be so successful, and I'm the leader of the business, so I'm always on. This is the way to get hold of me, so I'm never resting. Or do you find that you can do both? Are there ways to segregate your life so that you can be available, but on your terms?
I would say I'm not a big fan of the work-life balance concept. Because for me, if you truly enjoy what you do, that's life. That's part of your life. You shouldn't have to separate work and life. Work-life balance for me, and it might sound a little controversial, is for people who don't really like what they do for work. So they need a life component in order to escape the work they don't really like to do.
I love that. That's great.
For me, it's not about work-life balance. It's about work-rest balance. That in order to do the great work you want to do and to have the impact you want to have, you need to be rested. And so, yes, there will be times, or I would say seasons, where you might have to be on a little more. So if you're launching a product, if you're going live with an announcement, if you've got a new release coming out, around that time, you might have to be on a little more. But outside of that, it's how are you creating boundaries so that you can enjoy life rather than just be a slave to what you're doing. Because you're not going to get those years back.
I'm delighted you brought that up. The whole work-life balance is kind of a thing that people pussyfoot around a lot at the moment, especially, I have to say it, especially in the younger generations. And I'm always confronted by work-life balance. Okay, just explain what that means to me, and then I'll give you my response. Unfortunately, I'm sometimes thinking I'm going to tell you my response straight away before you explain it to me. But the way you explain it actually is quite useful. Work-rest balance. So you got to focus. You got one priority. Happens to be your business. I'll just say it is. So you got to put all your effort in your business, but you're going to balance that by having rest, so you can contribute when you're awake or when you're working hard. You can really focus on it. Now, it doesn't mean to say, you fish your time away, because I remember when I was 25, and I hate people who say this, in my day, so I'm not really saying that, but I do remember when I was 25, I wanted to do everything. Yesterday, I wanted to have everything. Why would you do something that kind of dilutes your ability to achieve all that stuff?
And this is the misconception. We feel that when we rest or when we pull back or when we're still, we're not productive. And that's why we feel like we always have to keep doing more. If I rest, I can't follow through or do the things that I wanted to do. But actually, if you look, and some of these might sound anecdotal, but they're true, rest is just as productive as doing something. So if we look at Thomas Edison at the height of his career would spend an hour every day going fishing. He would just go to the lake with his fishing rod in a bucket, and he would go fishing for 1 hour every day. However, despite all of those years fishing, he never caught a single fish. And a gentleman who observed this was curious one day, walked up to Edison and he said, "I'm really curious, Mr. Edison, but I've noticed you fishing a lot these past years, and you've never caught a single fish. Why? You can't be that bad of a fisherman." And Edison looked up at this guy smiling and said, well, as he reeled out his fishing rod, he said, "Well, it's because I fish with no bait. So no one, not even the fish, would disturb me." And he credited those moments as where he had his creative breakthroughs, as where he had those insights that he would then go back to the office to implement an experiment.
So it was his thinking time.
There you go.
Fishing.
So resting allows us to think. It connects us with our innate wisdom. We all have wisdom inside of us. The issue is when we're always doing, when we're always moving, we're not really accessing it. We're not really listening to what's inside, that inner guide, which is the opposite to the inner critic. But when you find moments of stillness, it's why if you talk to people in your circles who go on holidays, they often say, I've had so many ideas when I'm on holiday, or people going for a long hot bath or shower. The reason it's long is because they're just with their thoughts, and suddenly they're just thinking all of these amazing ideas coming up.
Something else I heard you say, and this may be the time to talk about, is like unlearning stuff. You know, like we can be kind of, and I got my own version of this maybe. I'd love to hear what tell me more about unlearning stuff, because it gets in the way if you don't unlearn it. It's constantly a liability as opposed to an asset.
In your life, depending on experiences you've gone through, we make decisions based on circumstance and our background. But we can only make a decision the best we can given what we know in that moment. Now, if you are constantly evolving, you're taking in new information, you're learning from new groups of people, you're reading great books, what happens is that in the consequential time periods, you can make different decisions because you now have more data, you have more information. And so in order for that to happen, you have to unlearn some things that may no longer serve you. And so again, that's a constant moment of reflection. What got me here isn't going to help me get to the next stage.
It's a constant moment of reflection. Can I just interrupt? Yeah. I have. By to say, yeah, but doesn't that sow seeds of doubt and say, oh, I got that wrong. Some of this other stuff is wrong too. It's like undermining your confidence, undermining what you think works for you.
Not necessarily. It depends how you approach it. So if you look at the past and dwell on the fact you could have made a better decision, of course, that's going to lead to self-doubt and uncertainty about your decisions going forward. Okay. But if you look back and just be proud of what you made at that point. I made the best decision I could with what I knew then. And actually, if you are a little embarrassed by the decisions you made a year ago or a few years before today, for me, that's a good thing. It shows you are evolving.
Growing.
It shows you growing. And so with your new knowledge now, you can say, okay, I did this back then. I'm about to move into this next phase. Now I know what I know now. What am I going to do differently?
In the business I created and ran for a time, we spent a lot of time, approximately time thinking about we made bad decisions. And we eventually figured out we made the best decisions we possibly could with the information we had at the time.
Absolutely.
And something new came up, which we really, then you could argue about, well, we should have known that. Well, we didn't know that at the time. Yeah. And maybe, there's a better way to find it, to dig that out. Next time we can really dig deeper. Is this really the case again? And we can, but actually, if you don't make that decision, you've got paralysis, right? You sit there, well, we don't know. Well, yeah, but it's your job to make a decision, irrespective of if you know everything. And you never know everything.
If you look at it, if you go for a setback and the decision you made wasn't the right decision, that's not a bad thing. Because when you return to the drawing board and you come back again, you're not starting from scratch. You're coming back with wisdom of experience. You've got the experience of having got it wrong, knowing what you now know because of that. Sure. You're able to approach it very differently.
But unlearning stuff is going a few steps beyond that. That's kind of admitting that...
It's being vulnerable.
Is it admitting anything? It's just realizing you're growing.
I think it's also being vulnerable because I find that when you're vulnerable, and this obviously depends with who you're vulnerable with, that's important to understand. If you're vulnerable with peers who are supportive of you and encouraging of your journey, it's actually really helpful because then they can point out maybe the things you don't always notice, that you don't always see. So when I'm working with my mentors and coaches, I'm very vulnerable. And I think when you're vulnerable and open to sharing what's inside of you, that's what invites people to help you. That's what invites the guides to come into your life and say, well, actually, you should speak to this person. Or, you know what? This author went through exactly the same thing you went through. Right. You should check out their story. Yeah. And so you're allowing people to help you. But if people don't know how to help you and you're just keeping it all in, then you're never really learning.
Vulnerability or just being authentic, just being honest. Versions of that. I remember that happening at a couple of points where somebody said, oh yeah, I can relate to that. I felt that way. So I'm going, really? It kind of brings you back to the very early days of New Covent Garden Soup Company. No, I came straight out of university, set this business up with my business partner, and he was a stockbroker. So he was a bit older, had more experience, but he didn't have any experience in the food industry. We were making stuff up all the time, but we had no evidence. And it was a crazy white-knuckle ride, and we had a tiger by the tail, so we had success, but we weren't quite sure why. We were hanging on for dear life because we had this new idea that people wanted. Great. But I remember sitting in rooms going, okay, who's responsible for this then? Or who's going to make a decision? And then I go, shit, me.
Yeah.
And you got to make a decision, not only without the information, but without the experience, without the knowledge, without the confidence that you know you're talking about. That's a really scary place to be. And I remember then my solution to that was go to business school for. I didn't have time to go to business school, but go part-time to business school to learn what like a P&L was about. I was responsible for P&L. But what is it? Well, it's like, you know, there's negatives and pluses, and you end up with hopefully, you know, a positive at the end of the day, at the bottom right-hand corner. Yeah. Great, but there's a lot more to it than that. But I'm not an accountant. Yeah, but you're responsible for a business, so you better get with this, guy. I'm talking to myself.
Yeah.
So that's a very scary place to be. So so you don't admit that in a group where you're reporting to you.
Yeah.
But you got to scramble pretty quickly to figure it out.
You've got to be resourceful.
Resourceful.
I remember one year I had the opportunity to ask Richard Branson a question, and I said to him, "What one advice would you give to somebody just starting out in business?" And he said, if an opportunity sounds fantastic, if it sounds like you can make it happen, but you're not sure how, say yes and figure it out after. Because he said, unless you say yes, it doesn't feel real. Say yes. So for example, in my case, it was when I started speaking. And so for me, when somebody came and says, "Hey, Simon, can you speak at this event?" I hadn't had much experience at that point. I said yes. And then it was in the diary. Now I've got to figure out how to make this work. So then I went and I started looking at YouTube channels for amazing speakers. I went to events where they had amazing speakers as well. And I really started understanding how to speak to an audience. And I don't think that would have happened unless I committed to that yes. And at that point, and I think, again, this is something entrepreneurs have to be mindful about. There's a huge difference between two words, the word of commitment and the word of interest. Lots of people are interested, few are committed. And this is why resolutions never work out. You know, when we start a new year, when people make resolutions, for me, it's just a list of interests. I'm interested in making this change this year. I'm interested in going to the gym more this year. I'm interested in this happening. But that's not really a commitment. That's just a list of interests. And if it's an interest, it only means you're 50-50.
The difference between interested and committed is like ham and eggs. Yeah, the chicken is interested, the pig is committed. So I thought, oh, okay, I understand that. I definitely understand that. But that story has stuck. That little kind of anecdote has stuck with me till today because, okay, maybe slightly extreme, but that is exactly what you're saying.
And you can feel it in people's words. You know, if somebody says to you, "Well, I've been thinking about this for a few years, and I think this year I really need to start," they're probably not going to start. But if somebody says to you, "Well, I've been thinking about what I want to achieve this year, I must begin, and I will call this person this week to get this moving," you know it's going to happen. Language is powerful because when you change something from "I need to" or "I should" to "I must," immediately that word carries a very different energy. It's one of the things I challenge my clients to do is I say, whenever you notice yourself saying "I need to" or "I should" or "I might," simply change those words to "I must." Notice the difference. Because to your brain, that language feels definitive. It's not "it might happen," but it's going to happen.
I can relate to that as well in a different way, which is going back to the very beginning, even pre-New Covent Garden. Right? And I went to university and I was a scientist, which is great if you're going to continue in a science role. But it's completely the wrong preparation for entrepreneurship because the two worlds are completely different. One is science-based, based on first principles and testing and proving and being certain before you go to the next stage. You never make a claim in science, you can back it up like 20 times. Very small, agonizingly small, slow steps to get to a point where I now know exactly what goes on here. To entrepreneurship, I haven't got time for any of that. I have an insight, a bit of gut feel, a seat of the pants, inspiration. I'm not deep down sure about anything. But then you get to a point where, from a science base, you wouldn't do that. You say, well, you don't know anything about this. You leave it to somebody who doesn't know about it. People with professional education, if you like, you know, doctors, lawyers, scientists, they're completely ill-prepared for a life of entrepreneurship. So tell me how, maybe it wasn't quite as extreme for you, but you came from the financial services world and then decided to do this.
But it's very different because, you know, just listen to what you said, you're right. It's very difficult to go from academics and theory to entrepreneurship because so much of entrepreneurship is about intuition, gut feel and feeling. And the best way I explain that to people who kind of say, well, how does that work on a practical level? I say, well, think about the person you got married to. When you decided that it was the right time to propose or it was the right time to get married, You didn't sit down and have a checklist and go, okay, now we've checked 90% of the boxes here. It's now the right time we get married. Are you ready for me to propose? Mm-hmm. You just felt it was the right time. People will often say, it just felt like the right time to get married. Same thing with kids. You didn't say, okay, now we're going to plan out kids this year. We're going to make sure we have 2 kids coming out. How are we going to do this? And then you have a specific plan and action to go. People just say, we felt like it was the right time to start trying for children. Mm-hmm. And so it's very much a feeling and intuition-based process. And it's the same thing for entrepreneurship. A lot of the times you're going about your work and then you have a gut feel about something and you feel, we should try this. We should have a conversation with this person. We should have a meeting here. Not because scientifically it's going to work out, mm-hmm. but because it's just a feeling inside that this is the right thing to do. For me, it was, when I talk about what was going on in my head as well, it was a transition from acting from my past to acting from my future. If I acted from my past, I would say things such as, well, I've never done this before. This will never work. Nobody in my family has ever started a business. What makes me think I'm going to succeed? Mm. That's acting from my past. But if I act from my future, it's thinking, well, what is my ideal future self that I would love to manifest? And how can I act from that person, that future Simon, today? Mm-hmm. I'm acting from the ideal future self, not from the past self, which would never be capable of doing the things that I want to do.
Sure. So something else I remember you speaking about before, or maybe I read about you, the emotional side of reinvention is like allowing pain to just be painful. And I got my own version of this in my own experience, and I suppose everybody does. I think a lot of the time people take that pain and shy away from it and put it in the bottom drawer and never let it out again because it's painful. And I think you say to use pain to a very constructive, positive purpose. Tell me what that means for you, or in your words, what that actually amounts to.
So for me, the way I see pain is that it is simply put the price of entry to developing yourself and fulfilling your potential. It's like a tax, if you will, on where you want to be. In the same way that the tax of becoming the healthiest version of yourself is discipline. The tax of succeeding as an entrepreneur is being comfortable with uncertainty. Pain is simply a tax of personal development. Mm-hmm. You have to go through those periods of pain, that struggle, if you will, in order to not only know what you're capable of, but in order to build that resilience. Mm-hmm. And so the way I've dealt with it is simply to see the journey like a game, to gamify the process. Because if I can gamify the pain and turn the negative into a positive, I become unstoppable. So I'll give an example. Most people's pain when they start a business is rejection. Nobody likes rejection, but we can dwell too much on rejections. So for me, to turn that pain into a game, I said to myself, okay, for the next 90 days, I'm going to target 100 rejections. Let's get out there and get 100 rejections. Now, if I played the game well, I would never actually get to 100 rejections. But at the same time, I didn't allow myself to dwell on the last rejection, because as soon as I had one rejection, I'm like, okay, here's the second one. Let's get the third one. But what happens is that you're learning from every rejection. The quicker the rejections you get, the faster you're learning. And so I remember getting to my 15th rejection. The 16th I went out to get became a yes. I'm like, okay, I'm starting to get some yeses now. And then the next few would be no's, and again there'll be another yes, and a few more no's again, and there'll be a yes. So by turning that into a game, it becomes fun. Another example is that when I'm making a bad decision, maybe it's an unhealthy decision. Again, when I go to get some food for home, to cook at home for the family, I might be tempted to get some unhealthy choices just because it's quick and easy. But instead I say, well, why don't I procrastinate on that a little bit? Maybe next week I'll get the bad one, the unhealthy choice. And then it gets to next week, I'll go, maybe next week I'll get the unhealthy choice. And so I end up procrastinating on the bad decision rather than the good decision.
Yeah, the gamify thing is a great way to kind of, you're kidding yourself in a way, but actually you're playing a game to your benefit. You might kid yourself a little bit, but actually it's to your long-term benefit. And the thing about, pitching or trying to get clients or doing whatever it is in terms of your business, keep getting up and keep not getting knocked down and go for no, because the probability is you get a yes. Yeah. The more no's you have. That's a slightly different angle on it. And the thing about it is it's resilience too. It's like saying nobody ever... Well, this is our problem. I think people do expect to get a yes. And then when they get a no, they're all disappointed because they put so much effort in perfecting this pitch and perfecting the deck. It's like when you're raising money.
Yeah.
You won't raise money off the first person you speak to. You might, but it'll
Yeah.
be completely like stroke of luck, or it'll be unusual.
Yeah.
It's against the grain. So you have to just, I think, when we were trying to get New Covent Garden Super Kenny off the ground, people are going, lots of reasons why it would, but I can tell you 20 more reasons why it won't work. Actually, you just haven't thought of those ones yet. But you're picking the one that comes to you first. Well, great, so you don't get it yet, and that's fine. So I'm going to look elsewhere, and I'm probably going to speak to a lot of people who don't get it yet. But if you people said no, oh my everything I've just thought I was going to do for the next 5 years is like undermined by this person saying no. Oh, well, hang on a second. Why did I know any better than you know? You need to get better at explaining and convincing, and energy comes into it. Also, everything comes into this. But it's like, and they still said no. Oh, they just don't get it yet.
Yeah. It's also trusting yourself that you know deep down it will happen, but you're not attached to when, but you know it's going to happen. And so if you know it's going to happen, you carry a very different sort of energy than if you're entirely unsure if it's actually ever going to happen. And so if you know it's going to happen, but you're just not attached to when, you approach it not with an air of desperation, but an air of knowing that I'm going to do this with or without
you.
Yeah. You can come on board with us in this story, or you can go on with your normal life and this will succeed regardless.
But the pain that you feel from rejection and the pain I referred to in my career was a failed business.
Yeah.
I call it my shit sandwich, by the way. the one that worked, that worked, and the one in the middle that didn't work. A lot of shit. But I always say that I learned so much more from this one in the middle than the other two which worked really well. I learned a lot from all three. You don't really learn so much from the ones that work.
Yeah.
But pain, failure, you're very exposed, and it's very painful. And it's easy to say this, by the way. You got to go through. You're sitting in this valley of darkness, and and it's all you've let people down because you promised and you made claims, and all the rest of it's going on. You feel like, oh my God, how do I ever get out of this? The point about it is, what do I do now about making sure I never feel this pain again? Because this place I'm sitting in right now, it's not a great place to be, but it's a great place to have been. Because it galvanizes you to say, I'm never going to be in this place again. I'm not saying I'm not going to have some sort of degree of pain, but I'm not going to sit with this desperation of a failed business hanging around my neck. I'm not going to go out in a failure.
It's also having the humility to understand that every season you go through has a lesson to share with you. And if you have the humility to seek the lesson in each of those seasons, you become a better person for it.
Simon, I've heard you say about the 4,000 week.
The idea of knowing that the average life we have is 4,000 weeks is that it creates a sense of urgency. Again, too many of us think we have forever, but we don't. Tomorrow is never guaranteed. We operate as if we're going to live forever, but we don't. And even though we know life is short, even though we know there is an end, I don't think people really understand it, because if they did, they would make very different decisions. And so for me, when you create something visual, 4,000 weeks is hard hitting, because if you were to ask someone in weeks, how long do you think the average lifespan is? It's very rare people say 4,000 weeks. They often think we have a lot longer. But when you hear it like that, or you see something visual, it wakes you up and it gets you embracing the words, don't wait. Because so many of us are waiting. We're waiting for the perfect circumstance. We're waiting to be ready. We're waiting for the right moment. But if you can embrace the words, don't wait, not only will it become your antidote to regret, but it will set you on the path to fulfillment. And some people might have half of that chart left. Some people might have more or less, but it really gives you a macro understanding of where you're at in the journey.
And don't waste it.
There we go.
Wonderful. This has been a wonderful chat, Simon. It's probably one of the best. I don't want it to end, but it's going to have to end. It's going to have to end. But we got a series of quick fire questions for you. So don't overthink it.
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's go and do that. So, what's the one thing you believe that most people don't?
Hard work alone does not get you to success.
What is a belief that you had to let go in order to move forward?
I had to have achieved a certain level of success by societal standards in order to be accepted by my family and friends.
What's a non-negotiable for you in life?
Health.
Health.
Absolutely. Going to the gym, whether that's swimming, running, weight training, for me, that's a domino effect on every other behavior for the rest of the day.
Just one book you'd recommend.
One book I
It can't be your own.
That's a tough one. There's so many. I'm going to I'm gonna cheat here and go for two. The first one is a book called The Go-Giver by Bob Burg and John David Mann. The essence of the book is that the secret to success is giving by being a person of value, and that money is an echo of value. So the more value you give to the world, the more money you get. And the second book, in reference to what I mentioned earlier in this conversation, is The Third Door by Alex Banayan, which is a true story of how a 19-year-old kid created Third Doors to interview some of the most iconic people on earth, from Lady Gaga to Warren Buffett to Bill Gates and Steven Spielberg, all by being creative.
What's the best decision you've ever made in your life?
The best decision, I mean, so many best decisions of my life, but I think the best decision is marrying the person who's now my wife. Because I think when we talk about environment optimization, we cannot underestimate the role of your life partner, because they are the ones behind the scenes that either encourage you to take risk, to kind of become your best self, or that pull you back and limit you from what you can achieve. That's one aspect and fact of environment that I think not enough of us talk about.
Next question. We all, most of us, I think, really focus on productivity and efficiency. What's the biggest time waster that is really, disguised as proficiency or productivity?
I think, simply put, the biggest time waster is the phone. The phone, for a lot of us, the phone is the biggest time waster. And so even with the best intentions of going on and just checking a few notifications we have on our phone, we end up being looped into so many other things. And before we know it, 1 hour's gone, 2 hours gone, the distraction of the phone.
Okay.
And it takes us away from the things that actually matter. You've got given things like social media and a phone. On its own, objectively, they're great, but it's how you use it. If you're only using it to consume, then it's not productive at all. However, if you're using it to create, to put something out in the world that adds value to people's lives, that's a good thing. Then you're leveraging the tools we have.
Great learning there. What's the one thing you wish you did earlier in life?
I mean, I think this is probably the same thing with probably every entrepreneur I know that has gone from corporate to entrepreneurship, is I just wish I started earlier. Things always sound worse in our imagination than reality. For so long, I had made it feel harder than it actually is. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still hard, but I made it feel a lot harder than it actually was. And I put off beginning. I put off experimenting. I put off building relationships and going out there. And so the one thing I wish I would have done is started earlier.
What's the one piece of advice you give which you really struggled with actually doing yourself?
I would say the one I probably struggle the most is disconnecting. It's just finding time where you're not connected to anything at all, and you're just in the present moment being with your loved ones. That's probably the toughest one, especially now in my career, because I get a lot more opportunities coming in, and it's really understanding which ones to say yes and no to, and then also balancing that with time with my wife and daughter.
Energy. What's the fastest way people can raise their energy or improve their energy or move for positive energy space?
Fastest way to improve your energy, apart from the obvious one of going to the gym and doing some form of a workout, is a 3-step gratitude exercise. And it's simply this. Number one, write down the first person that comes to your mind that you're grateful for, that has had some impact on your life in making you who you are today. Number two, write down why in as much detail as you can. And number three, this is where the magic happens, pick up the phone, call that person and tell them exactly what you wrote down in step 2. Now, if that feels a little uncomfortable, at a minimum, what you want to do is to send a recorded voice note. The key is they have to hear your voice, because voice carries energy in a way that a text message or an email never can, because then they have to figure out the emotion that the words came from. So when you do that 3-step exercise, immediately it raises your energy because it connects you to abundance.
Do you give them any context before, or you just land this on them? Or
you just land on them.
Really?
You just drop them a voice and say, hey, I've been doing a bit of reflecting today, and I wanted to share with you that I'm really grateful for you being in my life because, and then you share what you wrote in step 2.
Final question. What's the one thing that people are not aware of in terms of your entrepreneurial journey? What is something that people don't know about?
One thing people aren't aware of, again, not just me, but I think a lot of people I know in entrepreneurship, which I think more of us need to know, is that very often I'm making things up as I go along. I don't have a fully formed plan for everything I do. I'm just like the people at the beginning of their journey. Despite the fact I'm further along the journey, I'm still figuring out a lot of the stuff as I go along, because I'm always testing, I'm trying new things, I'm starting new ideas and projects. I'm having to figure out a lot of this on my own. I'm almost like a student every year, because I'm having to teach myself new skills and learn from people ahead of me in a different area. So yeah, I'm making up a lot more than you think.
I'll tag on a little bit on that, though,
Yeah.
because I think what you do have is a framework which you can hang other ideas off. You're making up as you go along.
Yeah.
First of all, you admit that it's great, but you have a framework.
It's so important, because you don't want to be dragged emotionally to the highs of the successes or to the lows of depression or when things don't go well. You want to just keep yourself very steady, very sort of focused on the journey without being too emotionally attached to whether things work or not.
I think that's a place to stop. Simon Alexander Ong, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. I wish we would probably will. We've got the pub afterwards and carry on. Wonderful. Thanks a million.